Thank you for tuning into the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder, and this week I bring on my mentor, Gary Ward, author of What the Foot, the inventor of the flow motion model, and the founder of Anatomy in Motion, Finding Center, educational workshops that guide manual therapists, movement therapists, athletic trainers, strength coaches, anyone who deals with the body. He provides a blueprint for how the body moves, and that's in closed chain, as in walking, because you have to know how to walk before you can run. So why not know how every joint in the body moves when we walk? And that's what we're going to discuss. I hope you enjoy it. Well, it is truly my pleasure to invite a very special person back on the show, Gary Ward. He and I met, my gosh, it's over 8 years ago now. We're coming up on quite a few years. 2014, March.
2014, March, San Francisco.
Yes, Corte Madera. Yeah, it's at I think it was a Great Western. You were giving this course or workshop on anatomy and motion. And it was just the perfect timing for me. I had been studying a little bit of gait mechanics, and for decades I had been studying posture alignment, but not in the sense of how you take that resting posture and move through space. This was the next stage in it. Somebody sent me this excerpt from this book called What the Foot. I read through it and every sentence was ringing true and just bells were sounding. And I said, okay, this is a book I definitely have to order. And lo and behold, it arrived in the mail, and with a little insert, it said, if you like what you see, if you like what you read, maybe join me at a course. And I'm thinking, well, I just sent away to Europe for this book. I would love to just tell my wife and kids I'm leaving and I'm going to Europe for a week or two. But as it turned out, where was the course? But right in San Francisco, just an hour or so north of me. And it was like things, I don't believe in planetary alignments and astral projections or whatnot, but that was one moment where I would maybe consider it. And the rest is history, Gary. It's been so wonderful to be tutored, to be educated, to be under your tutelage and mentoring when it comes to understanding every aspect of biomechanics as it relates to the gait cycle. So first, I'm going to welcome you on. And then we'll give a quick synopsis about the flow motion model and so on, and then let's dive deep into biomechanics. So Gary, hey, welcome. You're still in London, but the limitations there with COVID have opened up, right?
Yep.
For the most part, you're traveling about.
Yeah, we're traveling. We're teaching live courses again. COVID was, I think, probably for everybody a tough time, wasn't it? But it's for us, it's drawn a very distinct line in between the past and the present, and obviously what will become the future. So I feel like that period of time was our opportunity to get a lot of our information online and on the courses. Get the courses online, so that we could reach out to people far and flung places. Which we did that. We've got a couple of courses online for people to dive into, and we're in the edit stage of actually the flow motion model as well, which I think is something you want to talk about. But the flow motion model will be available to study online. It's been a difficult thing because it is so deep and so complex and yet simple at the same time, and trying to just put that into a screen that you can learn from has been a fascinating challenge, I have to be honest.
I imagine, my gosh. Okay, so for the listening audience may not be familiar with anatomy and motion and the flow motion model and Gary Ward himself, I'll give you a quick, perhaps, background. When I began taking your coursework, it was in different levels or stages where we understood what was happening in a certain moment in the gait cycle through every joint in the body through three-dimensional space. And then we took it to a different phase in the gait cycle and eventually combined all the phases together for one full cycle and ultimately understanding all the articulations, all the biomechanics. But it took, for me, several years of really studying and ingraining it into my body and seeing it in other people for me to truly comprehend the flow motion model entirely, because we're talking 400 plus joint mechanics in the body that occur in less than 1 second's time. Over the course of the years, the formats of the workshops changed, ultimately leading just pre-COVID. There were 6-day immersion courses, and those eventually began broken up into a few different days. But you would spend 6 days immersing yourself in gait mechanics and biomechanics from the nose to the toes, essentially. And when COVID came around, well, couldn't do it in person. So Gary and his team created online courses for lower body biomechanics, closed chain, that is, upper body biomechanics, and more. And your educational platform that you can allow people to come in that have taken the coursework is just thousands, literally, I think over 1,000 hours of online information, videos, and so on. It's just, it's one of those things you just pick up and you get something new every time. But now let's just talk right now about what there is in terms of coursework and what it's looking like you say, moving into the future today and onward. And then we can delve into the biomechanics and they can get a sampling of what we're doing.
So as you say, these 6-day immersions was an opportunity to take somebody from not nothing, because they'd be a qualified practitioner, so they have their background, but they would all come from very varied backgrounds. And the thing that would tie them all together is that they're all working with the human body, and then that human body walks. And what they were coming to learn was to find out how it is that the body enjoys this footstep that it takes on a regular basis over and over again. And so I broke that down I'd say over 11 years, but there was a very quick period of building out what we call the 5 key phases when the foot is on the ground. And in each one of those phases is an opportunity to observe the joint mechanics that are taking place in a snapshot of time. So there is a moment, for instance, when the foot has the tripod on the ground, the foot is flat on the ground and it's pronating. And if we take a snapshot of that moment in time, can we take a look at what position a person would occupy in that moment? And if you took 10 people, they might all have 10 slightly different positions, but perhaps there's only one optimal one. And it's that optimal one that is the one that I drew up, documented, and have been kind of trying to make clear for people to understand. And so what we then do is we can take a look at those 10 people and see the 10 different positions that they're in, and recognize that there's one that we would like them all to be able to access in order to optimize that moment in time for that person. And that means somebody might be leaning with the head, they might have a pelvis that's too far left, the spine might be straight when it could be bent, a knee might be extending when it should be flexing. And so what we really need to know is the ideal or optimal position that the body should be accessing at that particular moment in time. And of course, when you take the moment before it and the moment after it and the subsequent moments after that, we have 12 phases ultimately that will get us from heel back to heel, heel strike back to heel strike, is we end up with a very clean journey of movement for a joint to experience both of its flexions and its extensions, both of its if it's a spine, it has to laterally flex to the left and laterally flex to the right. And then if it's a pelvis, it might want to rotate left and rotate right. And we know that that filters all the way down to the feet. So any limitations anywhere in the body, I was just thinking, let's say you fell on your side and you landed on your pelvis and it was bruised, and you didn't like adducting that hip, you didn't like sending your pelvis left, you might spend the next 6 weeks putting too much weight on your right foot, and that changes the whole shape of the body and it changes the way you walk. And some people get stuck in those moments in time, and then what happens is they occupy this position, they'll get compression areas in their body, they'll have areas of tension in their soft tissue, and they'll have these issues and complaints called pain and discomfort, which we then go for treatment. And this idea of chasing the symptom and treating their symptom, let's say it's a low back, there might not be anything wrong with the low back, it's just not able to be in a different position. So it gets held in a position because of a fall, They have some compression going through the low back. That's their symptom. And then what we do is we take a look at the system using the flow motion model to say, hey, you never get a chance to get your pelvis to the left. If you just got your pelvis to the left, you'd be able to open that space on the right. That would give you some space, give you some movement, give you some opportunity to experience the opposite of what's been causing you the problem. And so the model kind of gives us that, if that makes sense. To take the model, look at the moment the heel hits the ground, call that strike phase. In the gait world, it's called initial contact. What is it that you are thinking strike phase gives for you? What is initial contact? What are the details of initial contact? And people might say things like you need to have a dorsiflexed ankle, you need to it needs to be in front of you. I'm sure people have got their own idea of what that is, but for me, it was about strike phase is a whole body position and therefore a whole body opportunity. And if your body is not capable of accessing that whole body position, then the way you strike your heel in the ground will be compromised. And then from that position forward, the way you then enter into that foot flat moment, what we call suspension phase, is going to be altered to what it could be. So it won't be optimized. And that will flow through the model. We'll go from this faulty strike position because I couldn't adduct my hip, and we'll be playing catch up through the rest of the footstep. And so to break it down into, as you said, over 400 joint motions, which sounds pretty hectic. Thankfully, I don't think it is as hectic as that. Do you? I don't think it is as
No.
crazy as all of that. They are there. Those joint motions are there. But it's looking at the pelvis, for instance, in the sagittal plane, looking at it from the side, taking the pelvis, looking at it in the frontal plane, looking at it from the front or behind, and in the rotational plane, looking at it from the top down, and then documenting that journey. So in the sagittal plane in strike, into suspension in strike, into transition in strike, you follow it through. And then that has an impact on the hip. So we can follow the hip through. That has an impact on the knee, follow the knee through. I built it all up from the feet because that was where my fascination was and probably still is. That's the part of the body that really gave me an opportunity to look at the rest of it differently.
Certainly.
And so the flow motion model is it is a documented description of the journey of every single bone and joint through the gait cycle, which, like you said, lasts between 0.6 and 0.8 seconds. So if you're on a watch gait, you're going to see a few big things. You'll see a pelvis moving, an arm swinging, a rock to the left. But when you have the flow motion model in your back pocket, you are able to observe every single joint and how it's interacting with each other in each moment of the footstep. So that's the when you've got that, that's your access point for application, to work with a client, to work with yourself, to make sense of issues that you have or your client has. And it's it really is a movement orientated process then that becomes a therapeutic practice for a person to overcome their issues and bodily disturbances.
Yeah, and for me too, working with not only the general population but with the athletic population, this just made so much more sense because the old adage of you need to walk before you can run, or you need to be able to have proper walking mechanics before you get on a tennis court or a basketball court or a soccer pitch, whatever the case may be. And so we can use this as, I won't say as screening, but potentially as an assessment process to see where are there relationships that are not the most efficient within the system that is this athlete. And rather than other kind of screenings, which have their place and time and all that, but everything revolves back to an integrative unit and how it functions. So in terms of like non-contact injuries in sports, understanding when the foot strikes the ground or any closed chain biomechanics of that nature, it's just going to reveal so much more and give you opportunity to try to encourage a new experience that isn't happening, or maybe an old experience that has been shifted away from because of other previous experiences like injuries or some episodes, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's fantastic. I'm curious though. There's so many people before you that have been looking at gait, and there's so many books out there that speak of it. However, there's some how would I say it? There's some, I wouldn't say disagreements, but there's conflicting information. Uh, would you
Yeah,
agree?
I do. And I think that's what I
Why?
love most of it about it. I think learning anatomy was about learning rules. And those rules, I'm wondering if I'm pausing, so I'm wondering if rules is the right word. What I like about the flow motion model is that there are things that I'll give you an example before I say that. A biomechanist was on a course a long time ago, and when you pronate the foot and you weight bear on the foot, there is a moment where you will flex the hip and anterior tilt the pelvis. This was enough to upset the thinking and following of the course, if you like, for this biomechanist, because what they had learnt was that when you flex the hip, you posterior tilt the pelvis, which of course, if you lay on your back and flex your knee, you'll roll your pelvis posteriorly into the couch, or table. And so that when I used the word rule before, that then became a rule. So hip flexion and posterior tilt come together. Now, if you then watch the hip and the pelvis through the cycle, and what you can't do is watch somebody and document somebody, because they'll be doing it wrong. What you need to do is look at the joint surface anatomy and the timings and the relationships of movement as you go segment by segment to end up at the point when the hip flexes and the pelvis anterior tilts, and recognize that it's just broken a rule for someone, and everybody brings their own rules into the course. Now, there is another moment in the cycle where the hip is flexing and the pelvis is posterior tilting. So we actually have both present and show up in the cycle. Other rules, I talk a lot about in What the Foot about how pronation has this kind of evil connotation, and then we see it in the cycle. It's not something that we want to prevent from being part of the cycle. It's to recognize that it's really necessary. And actually, without it, a bunch of other movements could not take place. And actually, one of them would be an anterior tilting pelvis with a flexing hip. So building the model, documenting the model in a non-judgmental space where you're just asking, what is the anatomy supposed to do and when does it do it? You went, oh, that's when that happens. Oh, that's where's that thing that I thought shouldn't happen is actually happening. So the good thing about the model is that everything goes, anything goes, and there are moments in time for every joint motion and pretty much every outcome. But the trick is to notice when they show up, how they show up, and in what overall body position they get involved in. So I got to this idea that actually all movement is necessary. We shouldn't necessarily be eliminating any movement. We shouldn't be denying people of movement. We can use muscle tissue and tendon and ligament attachments to kind of clarify that almost, where we get to then see how a pronation, for instance, is necessary, because it's when you actually pronate the foot that you put so much life into the tissues. You actually, I call it wake the foot up, because I don't have a specific percentage in my head, but I'm going to say 95% of the tissues in the foot are set up to they wake up as you pronate the foot. They then, from a lengthened position, can contract to turn that foot into a supinated shape. Now, if you don't have the pronation, that stimulus into the soft tissue doesn't actually take place. So it's not something you should take away. It's something we want to say, actually, it's necessary. there's so many movements in the body, like a protracted shoulder, like would be something that in a clinic we want to take away from somebody, but to recognize that a protracted shoulder has a moment in the cycle. What about a compressed hip or a decompressed hip? They have moments in the cycle where the hip will be doing its compressing and its decompressing. So there's not a thing, and this is actually leading me on to the idea that I think every single syndrome and itis that we have labeled also can show up in the cycle. So what if all of those syndromes, itises, problems, what if they are just when we get stuck in these moments in time? And so if we're stuck in a body position or a body posture that is the only one I can access when I'm walking, and then we assess you and go, did you recognize that in this particular phase of gait, you're not able to do this particular movement in this particular part of your body, and create an exercise to re-invite you to explore that, which sets your brain off in all kinds of directions to recognize the value of that movement, and then slowly pull you out of the old position into a new position. Not with the intention of taking the pain away, but to get people optimizing their joint mechanics. The pain going away is an outcome. It's actually never the intention for me anyway. I don't set about working with a client to make them pain-free. I set about optimizing their mechanics and watch with fascination what happens in the journey that they're about to embark upon. So it was quite a roundabout way of saying,
no, that's great. I mean, that was the thing that
is necessary, and all of these little movements, we shouldn't be saying some are good and some are bad. They're there. And so your question was what's different to what everyone else has done? And I think, and I'm bold enough to say it, a lot of it was done on watching people walk versus documenting a theory about how you should based on your joint surface anatomy. And the two, obviously, they do bump into each other, and there is a clash there. And so mine is a should model, which is that you should be able to do this, that you have this potential in your system. And the other one is this is what happens when we watch you walk. So unfortunately, I don't think there's anybody you could just take off the street and have them walk in the should way. They're all going to walk in their own way, and they're all slightly different. They've all got these nuances, and we're not here to influence that either. We're here to make sure you have the best opportunity. And the best opportunity is to sit in the space of recognizing that a foot should pronate and supinate, not just supinate, or not just remain in a pronated position through the footstep. If that's happening for someone and they've got back pain, we should address that. A pelvis should be able to travel to the left and travel to the right. A spine should be able to rotate in both directions. If you don't have that going on and you've got problems somewhere, we can address that. And we're actually able to succinctly dive into a very, very specific part of a person's structure in order to set them free. That's the beauty of it. It is actually a map that we can then learn to navigate really, really quickly and really successfully. And we're then putting it into the patient's we're putting it into the patient's handling. We say, you're definitely not accessing these movements. I'm going to introduce you to the movements. I'll show you how to do the movements. I'll put you in the movements. And then we need to wait and see what the person does with it. Do they reject it? Do they accept it? Do they like it? Does it cause another problem? We have no idea what's going to happen at that point. And that for me has always been an enjoyable and fascinating part of it.
Well, I'm glad you bring that point up too, because it isn't necessarily a protocol, shall we say, the traditional kind of therapeutic protocol where if you've got this going on, then you need to do this, this, and this. And then you give them sheets of paper and let them walk out the door because, this is what you do for a hip or a knee or a shoulder or a neck. Instead, you're really interviewing the body. You're interviewing, okay, if we put this into the equation, what's the end of the equation looking like? And being an observer and not having any preconceived expectations. This is what's going to happen, because You can easily give somebody a couple of things and let them walk out the door. They feel a little bit better or whatever, and that's great. But to actually stop and go, okay, let's consider what happens next, and how is this body receiving it, and that just allows you to be a guide and not the end all expert, if that
Yeah.
would make sense.
Yeah, it needs
The
to be
body be the expert.
I think it needs to be let the body be the expert. It's a wonderful way of putting it. When it's a team relationship between you and the patient or the client. And for you, it's an opportunity to what I call shine a light on the dark places, which is the parts of their body that they didn't know that they weren't moving and didn't know they should. They didn't know that it could. Why would they know? And to be able to say to somebody that's not happening, to go to another level and say, actually, I think that's not happening because you damaged this at some point in your past. That's another level. And then to give them opportunities to put their body. If you do this well, you will end up putting somebody in a physical whole body position that they have not accessed for a long time. Neurologically, that is going to be highly impactful. Now, you might say, you don't realize that you can walk on your right foot, and then when you put your walk onto your left foot, you're in a completely different position. They look completely different. And so that there are aspects when that person's put their weight on the left foot, there are aspects of their anatomy that they're not accessing. And the big question is, what would happen if they could? I draw a lot of stick men. Every client would have a stick man attached to it. I'll just flick through my book to see if I've got any in here, or if this is a new enough book not to have seen a person. But every can you believe it? There isn't one there. But every person will have a shape, and I'll draw them, and they'll look a little bit like this, and that could be their resting posture.
So the hips or pelvis is laterally tilted in one direction, rib cage opposing that, and the head opposing the rib cage.
Yeah,
so we'll see that the spine has that kind of lateral snaking or scoliotic kind of almost action.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Now, if they were able to access the opposite shape, they would then be able to freely do that left and right. If they're not able to physically access that opposite shape, the way they put the other leg forward would not be too far off that. They might stand up straight. They might have a straight spine. So this guy whose spine is flexing to the right, laterally flexing to the right, the best he can do when he laterally flexes left is achieve a straight spine. It means he's never ever actually achieving a left lateral flexion. That left lateral flexion requires a pelvis that can laterally tilt the other way, a skull that can side flex the other way, the shoulder change, the scapular rotations, a hip that can adduct instead of be abducted. You start to recognize that person can very quickly be put in a position they've not been in for years. And the neurological impact of that is phenomenal. New tissue length, new tissue load, new tissue responsibility, new space in joints, new arterial and blood flow, even breathing into one side of a lung easier than you were before, are all possible outcomes from giving someone that opportunity. Whereas if you stay in this position and you go and foam roll your back, or get an injection, or strap it up for a few weeks, or go through some treatment protocol but you're not actually addressing their ability to completely change their body shape, then for me, that's a huge difference. I don't want to stay in that position and be treated and then just go about walking the way I have for the last 10 years. I want somebody to go out having a completely brand new experience in their body. And so these are the things that come out of the model that we can see really, really quickly. So when I'm teaching, I always put the gait analysis up on the screen and say, what do you see? And everybody's, oh, I can see this, that shoulder's dropped, and that arm swings, and that pelvis is high. And, they'll pull stuff out. Inevitably, we can all pull stuff out. And then we go through the build of the model, and then we say, we've got the same guy up and go, what do you see? And it's completely different, because you now know you're looking on a much more profound level instead of that superficial top layer.
Yeah, well said, because I have to give a chuckle after going through and really diving deep in these last 8 years here of getting a much profound understanding of human mechanics. When I hear people or see posts online of people giving a gait analysis of some sort, it's just so broad. It's so I won't say superficial, but they're seeing the large buckets without seeing the intricacies that might be playing the part of the underlying reasons that the body's moving the way it does. So yeah, flow motion model has been a key, and it has been my map. It's been my toolbox from which I can put all my tools in. I want to talk also, for one thing, I do want to comment, everything you've just said did not involve labeling muscles. You didn't even bring up, you mentioned soft tissue, you mentioned other things, but you mentioned joint motions, bony structures, and articulations. And that, I think, is a key component of trying to get across, because for many of us in the strength conditioning realm, and for that matter, maybe manual therapists themselves, we're so entrenched in what this muscle is doing, and this one's inhibited, or this one is whatever. And this is so refreshing to put these 630 some odd muscles of the body aside, 2/3 of which move for locomotion. So we're talking over 400 or 500 muscles or whatever. We can put that aside and we can just follow the articulations. We can follow the bony structures of the skull, the rib cage, the pelvis. It makes it so much cleaner. I'm just preaching to the choir, but it's so nice.
For me, I too was a muscle guy, and I still love muscles. But I've interrogated muscles so much that they make my head hurt. With joint anatomy, you know exactly where you are. At most, in one structure, you're going to have to worry about three things. And as I said earlier, when we were talking about the opportunities in the skeleton to see, for instance, we said anterior tilt with a hip flexion, but at another moment, posterior tilt with a hip flexion. So the glute, for instance, we know that if I contract a glute in a sagittal plane, hip extension is one outcome, posterior tilt is another outcome. Now, if at one moment in time I've got an anterior tilt, which lengthens the glute, and a hip flexion, which lengthens the glute, that's great. We've got a lengthened glute. But in the other moment in time, I've got a posterior tilt and a hip flexion. So I've got the posterior tilt, which shortens the glute, and at the same time, a hip flexion, which lengthens the glute. Now my head's starting to hurt. And that's only talking, that's only talking to you in one plane. So there are then you've got two ends to worry about in 3 planes. That's 6 opportunities for lengthening and shortening. And it gets very, very, my word is heady in here very, very quickly. And so I always remember saying that it is possible to put your body in a position where a muscle is long in the sagittal plane, short in the frontal plane, and doing nothing in the transverse plane. And I remember a guy almost fainting at the idea. And so I still remember his face. It's, you know where you are with joint anatomy. Muscles are set up to manage the joint system, and they will do whatever the hell they need to do that. So we can teach muscles, but they will only be able to do as much as the joint will let them. And so it really then becomes the joint focus. That's been my overall take home. And don't get me wrong, if you want to talk about a muscle, it can be really exciting, it can be fascinating. We can work out which planes they lengthen in, which planes they shorten in, which moments in time it turns out that strike phase is probably managed by the hamstring. That's a really big muscle to manage heel strike. The glutes and proximal hamstrings are really big moment for suspension phase. Adductors, their moment shows up in shift phase as we're transferring our weight from right leg to left. Psoas is really all about managing our propulsion phases. There's loads of other muscles in the body happening at the same time, but these ones show up where they are all 3 dimensions, all singing, all dancing, all lengthening to decelerate and control the movement. But in the other phases, you're going to find that they're short at one end while long at another end. They're kind of, it's a bit less inconsequential. There's moments when they are under load as the skeleton is like leaning into them. That becomes eccentric because they're contracting under load while lengthening. And then to stop that load, they contract back to pull the system back. But then the load comes off because as you become centered, there's no more pressure on the tissue. So then they can just have momentum while building up load on the other side. So there's muscles are fascinating. Joints are clear. And I always say joints give muscles something to do. So if you've got, you mentioned the word inhibited, if you've got inhibited muscles in the system, my question is why are they not being stimulated? And then you can look at the joint and you just ask the question, what's the muscle supposed to do? How does it lengthen? How does it shorten? What would that joint be able to do? And just asking how something lengthens and shortens, you recognize in order to do that, the joint must have to flex and extend.
Sure.
And so that's it. All joints have to do is visit either side of their center or neutral resting position. So they flex and extend, adduct, abduct, left and right rotate, or internally rotate, externally rotate, or laterally flex. You've got all these anatomical terms. Basically, it's how does the joint visit one side of its neutral position and the other, and that's where we get to see joint opening and closing, muscle lengthening and muscle shortening. And if you forget the name of the muscles and you can forget the fascial chains of the muscles, you've just got this whole bag of muscle that is just set up on the outside of this skeletal structure to manage it and guide it through space.
Okay. All right. So let's take a joint as we continue this. Let's take the knee, because there's a lot of there's a lot of different thoughts. I won't say controversy because it means that there's a lot of arguing, and maybe there is. But let's just take knee mechanics and how it relates to movement, especially in the closed chain environment. Because I think there's some there's some insight in there that you have that goes against conventional thought, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we've pre-framed this quite nicely in so much as if we follow the joint surface anatomy and the timing of the movement, we're guided towards the opportunity for the knee's movement through the cycle. And
we're only dealing with 2 planes of motion, right? Because the knee does not move through the frontal plane. So we can break it down into even simpler terms.
That in itself is also potentially contentious. It's my opinion that they don't move. It shouldn't move through the frontal plane. Two femoral heads sitting on the tibial plateau with 2 menisci. This is not a movement that you want to see happening in the knee. When they took my medial meniscus away a long time ago, this became a kind of possibility in my knee. Trust me, it doesn't not want to be. It's not how you want it to be. So it flexes and extends, and it internally and externally rotates. But if you look at a knee front on, and you get a sense that you've got that kind of valgus angle, the thing to recognize is that it's the orientation of the knee. So if you're looking at the tibia, and the tibia is rotated, it's the rotation that you're seeing, not a frontal plane movement. So if you then were to move your axis round again to be able to look straight at the tibia, you'd see a straight leg again. That's where I think there's the frontal plane isn't there. Not to mention there's no articulation really for that to happen. So the next thing, had a long chat, probably over a couple of years, with a lecturer who was doing my courses, and he really wasn't happy about what I was saying about the knee. Loved everything else but not the knee, and I couldn't understand how you could love everything else but not the knee. Anyway, long story short, at the end of it, and it prefaces what we're about to say, at the end of it, he had this moment going, oh, you're talking about the knee and the foot together. And I was thought, well, why wouldn't I? Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be? It's all been about how the foot moves and what the response is upwards. So when I pronate my foot, what happens at the knee? When I supinate my foot, what happens at the knee? So it's really important to recognize that a lot of the information we've been learning about the knee or been taught about the knee haven't taken into account the movement of the foot. Most feet don't move in both directions. They don't pronate and supinate. They're stuck in one. The movements are limited. They can't access their tripod. We find feet are generally problematic. There's a huge industry for feet. We know that there are the 26 bones. They all need to articulate in quite a specific way, and we're now able to say that they should strike the ground in a particular way, land on the ground on the tripod in a particular way, begin to supinate in a particular way while the foot is still on the ground, continue that supination as the heel lifts off, and continue that into that propulsive rigid lever moment where we achieve a maximum supination. So we have this one opportunity to pronate the foot, and the rest of it is a supination. That really, for me, really ramps the value of pronation up. That one moment in time has to be done well, and we're not doing it well, mostly because we're mostly pronated as people. And so if something is pronated, it won't have the possibility to pronate very well. It's a big conversation. Now, my knee then, if my foot is pronated and can't supinate, it's unable to experience both sides of its center, as we touched on a joint's need before. It's unlikely to have an influence on the knee as well. So let's go to, I'm just wondering how to pitch this, because it is complex and we're basically talking about it. And my old mentor kind of said, let's face it, movement's not a topic for radio. So knee extension and external rotation is what we think the knee mechanics are when a knee is straightening. And that means that knee flexion and internal rotation is what should be happening when a knee is bending. I don't see that happening. I've never seen that happening. And the reason, I think, is because of what we understand about the foot and the foot's movement.
How so?
It really is not a topic for radio. So when the foot pronates, you should all be able to stand up and pronate a foot. And what you should get a sense of is that your leg internally rotates.
Okay.
Okay. And so if we stand up, what you could do is you could stand up and rotate your pelvis to the right, and you would feel your left leg internally rotate and your foot pronate. And at the same time, you would feel your right leg externally rotate and hopefully your foot supinate. You might lose contact on the first metatarsal, which would take that supination potential away. That's something worth recognizing for yourself. But the knee, what you should be finding is that if you do that, rotate your pelvis to the right, there's your left knee bent and your right knee straightened. Now, when you pronate the foot, the natural partner to that is to internally rotate the femur. And when you supinate the foot, you have an external rotation in the femur. So what you can't do is supinate a foot and internally rotate the femur. And what you can't do is pronate a foot and externally rotate the femur. You might need to listen to that bit again. They're fixed. You can't do it. You could, if you stand up with your left leg forward, bend your knee, put your weight over the left foot, feel the foot kind of pronate or collapse towards the ground, or however it works out for you, and now try to rotate your femur externally. You won't be able to do it without pulling the foot out of its pronated position. It can't happen. Now we come down to semantics at the knee. What is an internal rotation at the knee? What is an external rotation at the knee? An external rotation in the knee is defined by having a tibia on a fixed femur a tibia that externally rotates as the knee bends. Or not even as the knee bends, I shouldn't say that, that's my add-on. So if you sit on the ground, are people going to see this?
Well, if they go to the YouTube channel, they certainly can. So if you're listening in the audio version, be sure to, notice the time right now and click over to YouTube so you can watch
No, I
this in
sit on the
person.
floor. This is a first for me in podcasts. If I sit
Yeah,
on the
please.
floor,
and again, the YouTube channel is Rocky Snyder, just my name. Go to YouTube, click on it, and it'll be one of the first ones to come up. All right.
this is a first for me on a podcast.
There we go.
There's more of me than this. So if the feet are filthy, embarrassing. Right, so with a bent knee, if I take the tibia, fix the femur, and rotate the tibia outwards, that would be an external rotation of the knee. If I turn it inwards, that would be an internal rotation of the knee. And both of these are taking place with the knee obviously flexed.
Okay.
Okay. If I pop the leg out like this, and it's straight, as I internally and externally rotate my tibia, my femur comes with it. So in essence, it's locked. Certainly.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to keep the knee extended and get the femur to rotate exclusively on its own.
Yeah, that's a full extension. Now, if I'm doing this, femur and tibia both rotating, there is no rotation happening in the knee. The whole leg is rotating, the knee is doing nothing.
And therefore the rotation's at the hip.
At the hip, yeah, correct. Now, if I take this knee and start to bend it, and again, invite you to do this at home, what you should get a sense of is that the tibia starts to roll out to outside. So that's me just flexing my knee. I end up in a externally rotated position with a flexed knee. And then as I straighten it again, it's trying to keep your femur still at this point. As I straighten it again, you get to see the tibia roll back up to where it started. So as I extend it, it's internally rotated. Now, if I have the ability to pronate my foot, when I pronate my foot like so, I get an internal rotation in the ankle that brings my tibia inside. And I always teach people that the femur will internally rotate more than the tibia, because the amount of ankle range in rotation at the subtalar joint axis is about 16 degrees. At the hip, when I can move my pelvis, I can move my pelvis a hell of a lot more than 16 degrees. So more movement at the pelvis means more movement in the femur and less movement in the tibia, which matches the movement in the ankle. So my femur is, when I pronate my foot, and my whole leg is going to internally rotate, but my femur will internally rotate more. And what that does is it leaves my tibia in relation external. So if my tibia remains external, even though the tibia is internally rotating, in relation to the femur above it, the tibia itself is more external, and that leaves an external rotation at the knee. So when I pronate the foot, I get flexion and external rotation. If that point in my pronation, I'll try to externally rotate my femur. See if we can create an opportunity to see it a bit better than that. If I bend the knee into the flexion external rotation, if I now try and externally rotate the femur, I stop pronating the foot. And as soon as, if you're really, if you have the ability to feel into your body, when you externally rotate that femur and your foot stops pronating and starts supinating, your knee will start to straighten. And all of that is, you have to do that in a place where you are no longer attempting to control your body. And if you're not attempting to control your body, you can allow it to be free and to guide you and show you what it does. So supinating foot in the gait cycle will always happen with a knee that is extending, a femur that's externally rotating beyond the tibia, creating an internal rotation in the knee, and a pronating foot will pronate, create an internal rotation of the leg, more internal rotation at the femur, which leaves the tibia external, giving us an external rotation at the knee. Now, if you want to look at where extension and external rotation come in and where flexion and internal rotation come in, you won't see them in the gait cycle.
But they could occur.
Possible in the knee. Correct. So there's 4 movements in the knee. 2 that we see in the gait cycle, 2 that we'll probably see more in lateral moving sports, lateral movements. The type of movement when you're squatting so let's say you're squatting, you're looking to keep your knees over second toe, if not more 4th and 5th. That, if you can think about doing that as you lower down, that should create a supination in your foot. So if I'm bending the knee, it's flexing. If I'm foot supinating and my femur is externally rotating, it's internally rotating. So with a supinated foot and a flexion, I can have flexion and internal rotation. And then the opposite, well, the other one I think is, I really don't understand why we are promoting extension and external rotation, because for me, that is the environment that you will see in a hyperextending knee. And so a knee that is extending, and you can see this on people. I shouldn't put, you'll see it in kids, you can see it in teenage girls, or it's where the kneecaps are facing inwards, because the kneecap, if you think of the kneecap as part of the femur, the kneecap facing inwards is telling you that the femur is internally rotating, and then turned out feet below it, or pronated foot below it with a knee that's able to extend. If the femur is in and the tibia is out, that's an external rotation, and with the knee extending, that's an extension with external rotation. It can only happen when the foot is pronating, because that's the only way we can get an external rotation in the knee. And it's that really uncomfortable looking knee that is actually kind of pushing on the medial condyles, pushing back on the inside, and it's gone past the point of extension. It's a hyperextension. So why we're promoting that in other areas of the industry, I really don't understand, because that for me is probably the most problematic of the 4 movements that we've just discussed.
So for those that want even a deeper understanding, not to cut short the conversation on the knee, but I do want to cover in the last minute or 2 that we have here, is that the live coursework, live workshops are back now, and they're being offered in the UK, Ireland, Canada, US, Australia, and they're all over, because now I will say that those of us who have been with you for this long and have embodied the work as to the best of our ability in different facets of health and wellness, some people being Pilates instructors or manual therapists, physical therapists, physiotherapists, strength coaches, and so on, you have now kind of opened the gate for more than just yourself to start to teach these courses. Yeah, well,
we have a team of mentors that we've been working with through the pandemic, and I'm really happy, I have to say, that people are willing to go out and teach this work in different parts of the world for me. So my role and responsibility in that is to make sure that the teaching is, following a pattern, if you like, that we're all teaching the same thing and that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, but we're all looking to do the same thing, which is to spread the truth about of human movement and how the body moves through the gait cycle based on its joint surface anatomy, not really through opinion or judgment, but actually just being dictated by the body itself. We're able to create an experience in people so they can feel what that feels like, and that is a natural outcome, that we're not forcing anyone to do it, and to be able to get the team in a position to do that is how I feel, you know, where my responsibility lies. A little segue into the two streams as live teaching and also online learning, because not everybody everywhere is going to be able to get to one of these live courses, but both are going to follow the same pattern. So we have what we call a 2-day lower limb workshop, which is a huge focus on the joint anatomy of a pronating and a supinating leg when the foot is on the ground, and all of the muscles. Remember that muscle conversation we had earlier today about how kind of confusing it is, really helping people to get an understanding of the real role of the muscles in relation to the movement. So that's a 2-day workshop. Synonymously to that, online we have our closed chain lower limb biomechanics, which is a 600-minute-ish course, so 10-hour course. Not, you know, I don't think it's much shorter than the 2-day experience that we'll be putting together, and covers absolutely the same everything that you need to know. So that's setting a base for us to move on from. So we now understand the mechanics of a pronating foot, supinating foot, which becomes a pronating leg and supinating leg. So we look at the mechanics all the way up to the pelvis and how the muscles overlay, how to use our wedges, where to put them to create what movement, to get the body shapes required to help us re-educate how to pronate and how to supinate. On top of that, then we have we move into the upper body. So we have a 2-day live upper body course, and that is and the synonymous to that is the not closed chain, the biomechanics of the upper body in motion. So it's another I think 600-ish minute course online, so online learning, both of which have CPD points and CEU points for different countries. The difference is the online one has like a quiz to guide you through the learning. The upper body has a big quiz at the end, which I know frustrates people, but we kind of want you to go through that hell to pop out on the other side with some relevant understanding and a real desire to kind of move forward. Don't really want that to put people off, and I'm not sure if it does or it doesn't, but I kind of still think that that's a really valuable part of the process. So we don't have the quizzes on the live courses. The 2 days is just going to take us through pelvis, spine, rib cage, cervical and skull, and all the muscles that connect, and the shoulders, how to involve the shoulders in the movements. Now we've got a good understanding of closed chain biomechanics from head to toe on what I would consider a basic level, although for most people it's probably quite advanced still. And then we go to the flow motion model 4-day workshop, which is where we're going to invite the student to build out the whole model with us over the 4 days. And that energy is carried on to the online course as well. So it's an opportunity to take all the theory and all of the learning from the previous 2 modules and build out the whole model almost for yourself. We're guiding you to do that, because I've always wanted people to have the experience of putting it together themselves, not just to be told that that's what it is, but to go through the process that I had to go through almost. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the application, which is it was going to be a 3-day, but I think it's now becoming a 4-day, another 4 days, which is actually 4 days of taking all of that information that I've just talked about and looking at how we actually physically use it with a person, either on ourselves or with someone else. And in that is incorporating the AIM method, which is basically to look at, in a nutshell, because I know we're short on time, but how we use a person's resting posture, how we assess a person's dynamic posture. Gait analysis is a big part of the flow motion model, but adding to that, and so basically taking a full case from client walking in the door, assessing, and I'll teach you the way that I've always assessed it, and it becomes a tool that you can use for yourself. And it's no different to what we've taught over the years, but containing it into a method so that people have got a real sense of, if I do this, I'll end up with that. And then it's all about the movements and how you make the most of our movements to give people the best opportunity to access all of their anatomy.
Well, that is going to be great. I'm going to put the descriptions or the links, how people can find out more about all the coursework online and in person, for sure, I wish I had another hour to chat because we could keep on going. I really do. But I
Yeah,
appreciate your time now. Maybe we'll just do a part two, not too far down the road.
yeah, I'd be happy to. Always happy to chat with you. You didn't tell other people you're going to be the teacher, one of the
Oh,
teachers,
yeah, that's one of those little kind
not
of
just a
asterisks we'll put there
glamorous,
too.
not just a glamorous podcast host.
Man, I love you. Thank you so much. That brings this episode of the Zealous Podcast to a close. I know what you're thinking. Man, you guys just got started. I mean, talking about the knee. What are we going to do next time? Oh, I know. Scapula, SI joints, a whole bunch of different areas that should move in three-dimensional space, but probably get a little gunked up, depending upon what you've been doing with your life and what sports you've been doing for that matter. Heck, we're going to bring Gary back on in the not too distant future. Make sure you subscribe, earmark us, hit the bell, whatever icon's down there to let you know when the next episode occurs, which is every Monday, 6 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. We'll see you then.